In many interviews, you've mentioned that Superunknown was a very difficult album to make. Why was it so tough?
Well, a lot of reasons, really. I mean, it was difficult getting over the hump to get them in the studio, because when they first sent me demos, they didn't have a finished record. They didn't have anything close to it, and I told them that they needed more songs before we could get started. And I realized that, when I said that, that was possible grounds right there, right then and there, for me to get axed. Mm-hmm. You know, they didn't know me, I didn't know them, and here I am telling them that they don't have enough material to make the record. But it had to get said, otherwise they wouldn't have the kind of record that I knew they had to make. When we got into the studio, I already had like a game plan for how it was going to get made, and I very soon after we got into the studio, I realized that my game plan was not really going well with what their idea of how the record was going to would be. Mm-hmm. And they were very opposed to the approach that I was taking. And somehow I didn't get fired, which was good. But you know, it was a lot of headache. I think they didn't appreciate how methodical I was with everything. Because I saw the record as being a very important step for everybody on the project, myself included. But it was a chance to do something of immense magnitude. I mean, this was a band that were essentially on the verge of achieving tremendous notoriety and stardom, if you want to use the term. And really, I'd been hired in many ways, although I don't think the band would have ever copped to this. I was hired to help them get to that point. Mm. And that's how I saw my job. I saw my job as I had to get the best out of these guys by any means necessary. So that's what I did. When we got into the studio, I was very methodical about positioning mics, like where we put stuff in the room, which is obviously something you would normally do as a producer anyway, but swapping mics out, changing drum heads. Does this tom work better than that one? You know, just running through this endless litany of stuff until we had these wonderful, wonderful instrument sounds, which is not what the band wanted. They wanted to make a quick record. They were hoping to be in and out of the studio in a couple weeks. You know, they'd wanted to record everything live. Of course, we'd never had these conversations going into the project. Mm-hmm. So it was one of those things where it was kind of like, oh, okay, well, you know, looks like we're stuck together for the next few months, huh? And that, you know, I think that started us off on a bad footing, and there were just varying degrees of, it just wasn't a very fun vibe to make. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of hard work, as a recording should be, but, you know, that's how that particular situation panned out. And in the end, it's like, okay, well, we got the results we needed. So whether it was a hard record to make or not, whether we got along or not, doesn't make any difference.
And do you remember what was your vision for that album when you first started working on it?
How do you mean exactly?
Like the sound, did it came out the way you wanted?
I've always had a tendency to approach recording from, I guess, kind of a conceptual mm-hmm. aspect, because I was a visual artist before I got into music production. And I like the idea of the concept. And I just envisioned a particular type of sound relative to certain, I guess, productions that I'd heard in the past, and a couple of visual artists who I loved very much. One of them is a guy named Chuck Close, who's a very famous photorealist. And he did these paintings of people's faces that were very, very big. And they were just incredibly, like, even if you got close up mm-hmm. to the painting, it was hard. It wasn't easy to see brush strokes in it. And and obviously from further back, it's as if you're looking at a Polaroid shot or a high resolution photograph of a person, but the depth is so intense and it's so powerful that there's sort of an otherworldliness about it. And I loved the idea of relating that to making a rock record, because I just found that the records that people made at that time, the rock records, I just didn't like the way most of them sounded. Like, they didn't have a whole lot of impact. There wasn't a lot of emotional impact to them either. I mean, versus the sonic impact, there wasn't a lot of like bottom end or punch or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I love the idea of the specificity of the instruments, the being able to hear the grit on the guitar in the same, I guess, sonic space as the rattle on a snare drum, for example, like being able to have those sounds be larger than life and also highly delineated as well. So that was really those were sort of those ideas are what sort of guided me in the process. Like, from there, obviously, there's something else that happens, which I don't think it's possible to put into words, where you're sort of interpolating a conceptual idea into an actual physical model based through audio recording. Like, mm-hmm. The way I could describe that to you is I can't. It's something that it's something that just happens, right?
Sure.
That's what I would say anyhow. It just happens. I don't know that that's something that everyone does or is capable of doing, but it's definitely something that I do, and I enjoy it very much because it excites me very much. It makes the process much more fun and much more stimulating.
And is it true that most of the drums on Superunknown were recorded without a click track, and Matt recorded them alone without any reference?
He used the click for, I guess, to start the song, to just get the idea of tempo. But I'm pretty sure he didn't really record. He didn't record with a click. I can't remember 100%. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, yeah, we tried to record everything without any other instruments. There are a couple of songs where we did, and the reason for that is I found on that particular session, and I find in general, that when musicians play together in a studio, it's a lot different than live, And in the 90s, there was this really sort of romantic ideal that, hey, we should go into the studio and track live because that's how the Stones did it or the Beatles did it or something like that. And it's like, well, you're not fucking the Stones, you're not Led Zeppelin or anything like that, and you're tracking in a completely different way. Those guys, they didn't play their instruments loud. I'm sure, obviously, John Bonham is beating the shit out of his drums, but like all the other instruments are relatively low because they had to suppress the bleed. Mm-hmm. If you want to make a record where everything's loud, you're going to wind up with raw power, which is one of the greatest records ever made. It also sounds like dog shit. With that said, I remember hearing Iggy Pop's remix of it, which sounds where everything's organized, and it's horrible. So the sonic quality of that record contributes to how great it is. But I digress. Anyway, we had to cut each thing separately, each component separately, because when you get two people in the studio recording together and their instruments are loud and they're banging away trying to get the vibe going, and they're listening in headphones and they're not used to recording in a studio, which the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin were very, very much used to, because you didn't really have the capability to record multi-track. By the time a record like Superunknown was being made, we had years and years of people who relished the idea of tracking things individually and were able to take advantage of the value that brought. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you're going to get a more exciting, better record from tracking everything together just seemed to be kind of like, why? We don't do it that way, and it doesn't ultimately make it any better. You wind up with a shittier sounding record for the most part, So we tried, because those guys did have this idea that they were going to track everything live, and we tried to do it like that. And that did not work with the aesthetic of the record. So it was like, look, Matt has to track his drums separately. That's just how it's going to go down. And we did it. And when you listen to it, it sounds like the band are playing together.
Yeah.
Because they could do it. Because people are used to, because people were and are used to tracking like that.
Mm-hmm. And what was the process like for recording the vocals?
As far, just overall,
Mm-hmm.
when it was time to cut vocals, we went through a whole process of trying to find vocal mics for Chris. And once again, I had a very specific idea of how I wanted the vocals to sound. And it involved proximity. Like, he had to get right up on the microphone, which sadly ruled out about 99% of the world's microphones. Because obviously most vocalists will sing, relatively speaking, a decent distance from microphones. I personally don't like that, and I never have. I just prefer this kind of proximity, because I want to pick up every little detail of what a vocalist is doing. And with Chris's voice, it was so powerful that most of the diaphragms of microphones, like a really nice U47 or a 251, they just go like when he starts singing into that. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it would sound great when he's in one range, but then when he goes into screaming, it changes completely. So we couldn't find a microphone that could handle everything. So after testing a multitude of microphones, I settled on a U67 that the studio had for his quiet parts, and a U47 FET that had been modified by Klaus Heine for his screaming. And it worked. But he had to do all his screaming and his normal singing completely separately, which isn't good for performance. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, I had the engineer create these ridiculous signal chains for both microphones. Like, I think it was like 4 EQs and 4 compressors on each mic. Something ridiculous, right? So, but I was going for something, and, whatever. Mm-hmm. Everyone thought I was nuts, but fine. We did it, and I didn't care. And we did the first 4 songs like that, because we were doing them in batches of 4. But then when it came time to do the rest of the record, it occurred to me that this was an exercise in futility, because more than anything, it was driving Chris crazy, because he couldn't do a complete vocal performance. It's nice because when you listen to his vocals now on the record, you can't tell which songs were cut that way and which weren't, which is good. But I was like, I need to get like a solid vocal performance from this guy, if only not to like waste a whole bunch of time and to not frustrate him. So we went through the microphone test again and tried like some of the same mics that we tried before. They all sucked. And it just occurred to me at that point that we should try microphones that had flat responses to them, because the ones that had more character, it was too much character. Mm-hmm. It just didn't work with Chris. So I got a Sanken CU41, a B&K, I think 4007, a couple of others, and the Neumann U87, which is it's a microphone that I think a lot of people swear by, but up till that point I'd never used one on a vocal because I couldn't stand them. I just don't like the way they sound on vocals. They've never sounded good to any vocalist, and that was the mic that made the cut. Hands down, he could navigate through quiet parts and loud parts on it. He could sing right up on it. I mean, he wound up destroying the diaphragms on the microphones. He literally destroyed them. Like, we had to buy new diaphragms for the studio had 5 U87s, and we had to buy new diaphragms for all of them. That's how quickly he destroyed them, because his voice was so powerful. But I was also able to change the signal path, and just went into a 1073, a Neve 1073, out into a Yuri 1176, and then into a GML 8200, just to kind of dial in a little bit of top, and that was it. It was a very simple vocal signal, very basic. Then we got him out in the room and started him singing, and it was funny because I started to notice that he seemed incredibly uncomfortable, and it just occurred to me like Chris was an expert at making his own demos. So why not put him in the control room and have him do all the recording himself? So we moved everything into the studio. We set him up in front of the console, gave him the microphone. I showed him how to operate the Studer 827, how to arm, disarm tracks, how to move stuff around the patch bay. We set the microphone up so it was directly behind the NS10s, which we flipped out of phase, so there'd be no low end hitting the microphone. Obviously, if it hits the null point on the microphone, because it's in cardioid, you're not picking up. You don't get a whole lot of bleed that way. And it was great because we A-B'd what the bleed was like when he was in the other room wearing headphones versus the speakers being out of phase and no headphones. Bleed was actually less in the control room. Whoa. It was great. And I just said to him, "You're on your own, pal. We're not going to be in the room with you. You have the con. Best of luck. Do as many vocal takes as you can. And when you feel like you got the song, just come get me and we'll start comping." And I remember the first day he did that, he just came down to the lounge where we were hanging out. And he was like all out of breath from singing. He was like, "I'm never singing anyway again. This is incredible." He was so happy. It was great.
To watch the full video, click the link below and don't forget to subscribe.